In the spring of 1903, a team of excavators working under the direction of Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht at the ancient Mesopotamian site of Nippur uncovered something that would not be fully understood for nearly a century. Buried beneath more than 6 meters of compacted debris, sealed within a clay vessel that had been deliberately placed beneath the foundation of what appears to have been a royal administrative building, lay a collection of cuneiform tablets unlike anything that had been recovered from the site before. The tablets, catalogued as part of the Nippur collection, now held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, were inscribed in a late Sumerian script that differed markedly from the administrative documents, hymns, and astronomical records that comprised the bulk of the Nippur archive. The content was not temple inventory, not agricultural accounting, not astronomical observation. What the tablets appeared to contain, once the painstaking work of translation had been completed across several subsequent decades, was a scribal record of an encounter with a dying ruler. A first-person account of final conversations, final commands, and final observations that a royal scribe had set down in the closing hours of a king's life, then deliberately hidden beneath the earth in a manner that suggests the act of concealment was itself ritualized, intentional, and charged with meaning that has only recently begun to be understood. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the personal drama of a dying monarch. The tablets reveal a level of scribal sophistication, psychological awareness, and cosmological understanding that challenges conventional narratives about the cognitive and cultural complexity of early Mesopotamian civilization. More significantly, they preserve details about royal knowledge systems, succession protocols, and the relationship between human rulers and the divine hierarchy they served that align with interpretations of Sumerian religious texts that mainstream archaeology has consistently struggled to incorporate. The dying king, whose identity the tablets themselves partially obscure through deliberate archaic encoding, speaks of things he has witnessed during his reign that his successors must understand. He describes knowledge that was given rather than discovered, systems that were inherited rather than independently developed, and a cosmic order that operates on timescales so vast that human kingship represents merely one phase in a cycle of events far older than any living person's memory. If this investigation challenges what you believed you knew about the ancient world and the origins of human civilization, consider following this channel as we continue examining the evidence that conventional archaeology has struggled to explain. The material we are about to examine spans 4 millennia and multiple continents, drawing connections between the content of these buried tablets and the architectural precision of structures built thousands of years before any known civilization, the astronomical sophistication encoded in monuments that mainstream scholarship still cannot fully account for, and a consistent global pattern of advanced knowledge appearing in human cultures without traceable developmental stages. The Nippur expeditions conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900 represent one of the largest coordinated archaeological undertakings of the 19th century, producing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that transformed scholarly understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. Yet among the approximately 30,000 fragments recovered from this extraordinary site, a specific collection of tablets designated within the University Museum's catalogue under the series prefix CBS, standing for the collection of the Babylonian section, went largely unexamined for decades after their physical recovery. The tablets in question, assigned catalogue numbers CBS 10,673 through CBS 10,689, were noted in field records by expedition epigrapher John Peters as differing markedly from surrounding material written in an archaic Sumerian script that suggested either extreme antiquity or deliberate archaism, and associated with what Peters described in his field notes as a sealed ceramic vessel placed with evident intentionality. The circumstances of their burial separated them immediately from the accidental preservation that characterized most of the Nippur archive. These tablets had not been lost, they had been hidden. Understanding why requires examining not only what they contain, but the specific physical context in which they were placed, a context that every aspect of their recovery suggests was designed to ensure both preservation and controlled inaccessibility for an extended period that the ancient scribe who concealed them may have calculated with greater precision than any modern archaeologist initially suspected. The vessel itself, examined under controlled conditions at the University Museum by ceramic analyst Leon Legrain in the 1920s, proved to be a double-walled container approximately 43 centimeters in height, and sealed at its upper rim with a compound that Legrain identified as a combination of mineral pitch, powdered limestone, and a third substance he could not characterize with the analytical tools available to him at the time. The outer surface of the vessel bore no decorative markings, no dedicatory inscription, no ritual symbols of the kind that typically adorn objects placed in religious context within Mesopotamian sites. Its plainness was itself a statement. This was not an offering, it was a cache. The tablets inside, wrapped in what analysis of degraded organic residue suggested, had once been linen cloth treated with cedar oil, were arranged in a specific sequence that Legrain noted corresponded to no organizational system he recognized from other Nippur tablet caches, but that subsequent analysis would reveal followed the narrative order of the testimony they contained rather than any administrative classification principle. Somebody had organized these tablets the way you organize the chapters of a book, rather than the way you organize inventory, and that organizational decision tells us something profound about how the person who made it understood what these tablets were and what they were for. The site context surrounding the ceramic vessel provides equally significant evidence of deliberate intent. Peters documented in his excavation notes that the vessel had been placed not within a natural stratigraphic layer, but within a deliberately prepared pit cut into the floor of the administrative building's innermost chamber, a pit whose walls were lined with fired brick laid in a pattern distinct from the surrounding construction, and sealed above with a flat stone slab, fitted with a precision that Peters estimated required considerable preparation. Carbon analysis of charred organic material found within the pit lining, conducted by the University Museum's laboratory in 1978 as part of a systematic re-examination of excavation contexts from the early Nippur campaigns, produced a date range centered on approximately 1900 years before the Common Era, consistent with the late Sumerian administrative period, conventionally designated as the era of the Third Dynasty of Ur and its immediate aftermath. This dating places the concealment within a period of acute political instability. The collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur under Amorite pressure, and the transition to the competing city-states of the Isin-Lhasa period, a context that makes the act of deliberate concealment historically intelligible, while simultaneously raising a question that conventional explanations struggle to resolve. If these tablets were concealed during a period of political upheaval to prevent their destruction or seizure, why were they not recovered when stability returned? Every other major Mesopotamian archive produced during comparable periods of instability was eventually reclaimed by the institutional structures that produced it. These tablets were not. Their concealment was permanent, designed not for temporary protection, but for indefinite preservation against a future discovery whose timing the scribe apparently could not predict and did not try to control. The institutional history of the Nippur site reinforces this interpretation. Nippur was unique among major Mesopotamian urban centers in maintaining its sacred status across multiple political regimes and dynastic transitions. Rulers who controlled it changed repeatedly over 3,000 years, but the religious authority of its temple complex was recognized by Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Kassites, and Assyrians alike. The city was never truly abandoned by those who regarded it as sacred, which means that the tablets concealed within its innermost administrative chamber were not hidden from enemies, but hidden from the institutional structures of the city itself, from the priests, the scribes, the royal officials who would have had routine access to the building in which they lay. This is not concealment from outsiders, it is concealment within the system, by someone who understood the system intimately enough to know that the system itself was not the appropriate recipient of what these tablets contained. The institution of the Adubba, or tablet house, represented far more than an ancient schoolroom for the training of administrative clerks. Cuneiform text recovered from sites across southern Mesopotamia, including the substantial Adubba curriculum tablets discovered at Nippur and published by Samuel Noah Kramer, across a series of landmark translations beginning in the 1940s, reveal a scribal training system of extraordinary sophistication that encompassed not only the mechanics of cuneiform script, but an entire intellectual framework governing what knowledge could be recorded, under what circumstances and by whom. The most advanced graduates of the Adubba, designated in Sumerian texts by the title Umia, meaning master scribe, occupied positions within royal households that carried responsibilities extending far beyond the production of administrative documents. Umia scribes attached to royal courts were trained in what Sumerian educational texts describe as the secrets of the tablet house, a phrase that appears with striking regularity in documents discussing the highest levels of scribal instruction, and that has consistently resisted comfortable translation into conventional categories of ancient literacy. The tablets from Nippur designated CBS 10,673, and its companion fragments appear to have been produced by exactly this class of advanced royal scribe, someone trained not merely to record information, but to witness and preserve testimony that fell entirely outside the categories of normal administrative documentation, someone who understood that what the dying king was saying could not be placed in the ordinary archive, and who therefore enacted a solution that preserved the testimony while removing it from conventional scholarly access for a period of time measured not in years, but in millennia. Understanding the Umiya's training helps explain not only why the scribe made the decisions documented in the physical evidence, but how he was capable of making them. The Adubba curriculum as reconstructed from the Nippur curriculum tablets, analysed by Nick Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley, in his comprehensive 2004 study of Babylonian scholarly education, divided instruction into three progressively restricted tiers. The first tier, accessible to all students admitted to the institution, covered the basic sign lists, mathematical tables, and administrative formulae that constituted functional cuneiform literacy. The second tier, accessible to students who completed the first tier, with demonstrated excellence and received the recommendation of a senior Umiya, covered advanced literary texts, astronomical observation procedures, and the technical vocabularies of specialized craft and temple knowledge. The third tier documented only in fragmentary references within other Adubba texts and in passing allusions within administrative documents from major temple complexes, covered what the Sumerian sources designate as the Emegalam, meaning the great language or sometimes the hidden tongue, a body of knowledge whose precise content the surviving curriculum texts never describe directly, but whose possession is consistently associated with access to the innermost chambers of royal and temple administrative structures. The scribe who produced the CBS tablets was a graduate of this third tier. The evidence is internal to the tablets themselves. He employs sign combinations characteristic of Galem instruction throughout the document, in patterns that go beyond stylistic habit, into what can only be described as deliberate demonstration of his credentials, as if he understood that future readers who could recognize his scribal register would also understand the authority behind his testimony. The physical quality of the CBS tablets supports this assessment of their producer's exceptional training. Archaeological conservator Holly Pittman of the University of Pennsylvania, who conducted a detailed examination of the tablet surfaces as part of the University Museum's long-term Nippur materials review, noted in her published analysis that the sign incisions throughout the series show a consistency of depth, angle, and spacing that places their production among the highest quality cuneiform work recovered from the site. Pittman observed that the stylus control evident in the CBS tablets matched that of the finest administrative documents from the royal courts of Ur and Lagash, rather than the more variable quality typical of tablets produced in temple scribal schools or regional administrative centres. This was not a scribe working under pressure in difficult circumstances. This was a craftsman of the highest professional calibre, working carefully and deliberately, understanding that the physical permanence of what he was producing was as important as its content. Everything about the production of these tablets suggests they were made to last for a very long time by someone who knew exactly how long a very long time might be. One of the most immediately striking features of the Nippur death tablets is their consistent refusal to identify the dying king by the name conventions, used throughout the rest of the Sumerian royal tradition, where virtually every other royal inscription, hymn, and administrative document from the Ur-III period identifies its patron with full royal titulary, name, lineage, divine designation, and territorial claim. The CBS tablets employ what linguistic analyst Thorkild Jacobson, in his landmark 1973 analysis of Royal Sumerian literature, identified as a deliberate displacement of identity markers, substituting conventional royal names with a series of epithets and positional designations that could apply to multiple rulers across different dynasties. The scribe appears to have been following a specific protocol for rendering the king's identity simultaneously accessible to trained readers and opaque to uninitiated ones. This encoding system employs a technique found elsewhere in Mesopotamian esoteric literature, specifically in the so-called Nam-Shub texts that linguistic researcher Jeremy Black of Oxford University analysed in his comprehensive study of performative Sumerian, where phonetically ambiguous signs are combined in ways that produce multiple simultaneous readings, depending on which interpretive convention the reader applies. When the CBS tablets are read using the standard administrative convention, the royal subject appears to be generically designated as the Great Shepherd. When read using the esoteric convention documented in priestly training manuals from the temple library at Nippur, the same sign combinations produce a name that corresponds to a specific historical ruler, whose death date, recorded independently in the Sumerian king list, falls within the chronological window that carbon analysis of organic materials found within the sealing vessel suggests for the tablets themselves. The implications of this deliberate encoding are substantial, and they require careful unpacking against the backdrop of what is known about identity concealment in ancient Mesopotamian documents. Sumerian and Akkadian administrative tradition was in most respects obsessively precise about attribution. The legal validity of any document depended on the accurate identification of all parties to whatever transaction or event the document recorded, and the falsification or concealment of identity in official documents carried severe penalties documented in the legal codes of the period. For a royal scribe of Umir rank to deliberately conceal his subject's identity was therefore not a casual or routine choice, but a significant institutional transgression, one that required both the authority and the specific training to execute. Jakobson's analysis of the displacement technique identifies it in only 3 other Mesopotamian documentary contexts, all of them associated with the transmission of knowledge that the producing institution considered sensitive beyond normal categories of restricted access. The technique was not used to protect ordinary secrets. It was used to protect knowledge whose very association with a specific named individual might compromise either the individual's posthumous dignity or the knowledge's continued availability to the restricted class of readers capable of decoding it. The specific ruler that the esoteric reading of the identity markers points toward has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, not because the decoding procedure itself is disputed, but because the historical individual it identifies challenges assumptions about what a ruler of his period and position would have known or believed. Assyriologist Piotr Michalowski of the University of Michigan, in a 1989 analysis of royal self-representation in late Sumerian literature, documented a consistent pattern in the inscriptions of the ruler in question, suggesting awareness of cosmological frameworks substantially more sophisticated than those evident in the royal literature of his immediate contemporaries. The dying king's identity, once the esoteric convention is applied, turns out to be not an obscure or marginal figure but one of the most extensively documented rulers of the late Sumerian period, a king whose conventional inscriptions already show unusual intellectual preoccupations. The CBS tablets reveal that those preoccupations were not merely rhetorical posturing, but the surface expression of a private system of knowledge that he spent his reign assembling from sources he describes with a specificity and a matter-of-fact confidence that leave little room for interpretive softening. The opening lines of the CBS death tablets, once the archaic script is properly passed against the grammatical conventions of classical Sumerian, as documented by scholars including Marie-Christine Ludwig and Gonzalo Rubio, in their respective analyses of third millennium royal linguistic registers, present an immediate and sustained challenge to the assumption that ancient Mesopotamian rulers understood their position primarily in terms of territorial sovereignty and divine mandate. The dying king's first recorded statement, as preserved across the 3 most complete tablet fragments, establishes a cosmological framework that positions his personal death within a cycle of events vastly older than his individual reign, older than his dynasty, and older than the civilization his predecessors built along the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia. The king does not begin with a lament for his own suffering, nor with a conventional appeal to the divine pantheon for mercy or intercession. He begins instead with what can only be described as a summary of observations accumulated across his entire reign, a condensed account of what he believes he has confirmed through his access to temple archives, his conversations with the highest-ranking priests of the Abgal tradition, and his own astronomical observations conducted from the summit platform of the ziggurat complex at his capital city. He states, in terms that the scribe records without apparent surprise or qualification, that the current era of human civilization represents a restoration rather than an origin. that the institutions of kingship, temple administration, and astronomical record-keeping were not invented by his ancestors but recovered from sources far older than any memory preserved in the written archive. This opening claim, which might be dismissed as conventional royal boasting if it appeared in a public inscription, carries entirely different weight in the private context of a deathbed testimony addressed to successors who will face consequences if they act on it incorrectly. A ruler embellishing his public monuments has every incentive to claim divine ancestry and cosmic significance. A ruler dictating private instructions to his heirs in the final hours of his life has every incentive to be accurate. The CBS tablets bear the grammatical markers of the latter context throughout. They employ the direct address forms used in private administrative communication rather than the third-person rhetorical forms of public inscription, and they repeatedly use the conditional mood in discussing future scenarios that the king acknowledges he cannot guarantee, a grammatical register inconsistent with the confident absolutism of conventional royal literature. The king is not performing for an audience. He is transmitting a record to people he trusts about things he believes to be true and important, in a context where rhetorical exaggeration would actively undermine his purpose. What he chooses to address in his opening statement, given this context, becomes extraordinarily significant. The claim that civilization represents restoration rather than origin, that kingship and its associated knowledge systems were recovered rather than developed, appears in Sumerian literature in other contexts, most notably in the Sumerian king list's preamble, describing kingship descending from heaven before the Great Flood, and in the Eridu Genesis text that describes the divine instruction of the first cities. But those texts are public documents whose claims serve institutional legitimizing functions that make interpretation of their historical accuracy complicated. The dying king's private version of the same claim serves no political purpose. It serves only the purpose of accurate transmission to his heirs of what he genuinely believes about the nature of the civilization he has spent his life governing. Taken in that context, his conviction that he was living in a recovered world rather than a first one represents not mythology, but testimony, and the distinction matters enormously for what follows. Among the most controversial passages in the CBS death tablets is a sustained account, preserved across what appear to be 4 consecutive tablet fragments in the series, in which the dying king describes the sources of his most advanced knowledge in terms that resist every conventional category available to mainstream scholarship. The king explicitly distinguishes between knowledge he received through the normal channels of royal education, the Adaba curriculum, the temple library holdings, the astronomical records maintained by the professional clergy, and a separate category of knowledge that he describes using the Sumerian term Nignam-zu, meaning something approximately equivalent to the complete knowledge of all things, which he attributes to direct instruction from figures he consistently designates using the title Abgol, the same term that appears throughout Sumerian literature as the name for the 7 primordial sages who preceded the Great Flood. The critical element that separates these passages from conventional religious literature is the register in which they are written. Where mythological accounts of the Apkallu employ the elevated literary register typical of temple hymns and creation epics, the CBS tablets describe the king's encounters with these figures in the same matter-of-fact administrative register used to record trade negotiations, building inspections, and military reports. The king does not describe visions or dream encounters. He describes meetings. He describes specific locations within the temple complex where these encounters occurred. He describes the physical characteristics of the figures he met, including details about their height, their clothing, and the instruments they carried. and he expresses no apparent surprise at their presence, suggesting that contact of this kind was, within the world of the royal inner sanctum, not unusual but rather a regularized and institutionally expected aspect of advanced kingship. The specific physical descriptions the king provides of these figures deserve close attention precisely because they are so unexpectedly mundane. He does not describe radiant divine beings surrounded by celestial fire, the standard iconographic convention for representing divine manifestation in Sumerian religious art. He describes individuals of substantially greater height than typical Mesopotamian men, a detail he records with a measurement reference that places their stature at approximately 1.5 times normal human height, wearing garments whose material he describes as unlike any cloth produced in the workshops of his kingdom, carrying instruments whose function he understands imperfectly, but whose physical description corresponds in several details to the optical and measuring devices that appear in administrative texts associated with the highest level of temple astronomical work. The clothing description employs a Sumerian compound that appears in only one other known context, a late Ur-3 administrative tablet from the treasury records of Lagash that records the receipt of unusual garments delivered to the temple inner sanctum by what the tablet designates as personnel of the Great Above, a phrase that Sumerologist Dina Katz of the Free University of Amsterdam, in her 2003 analysis of Sumerian underworld and heaven terminology, identifies as a technical designation for beings originating outside the terrestrial administrative hierarchy. The instruments the king describes his teachers carrying have attracted particular attention from researchers approaching the CBS tablets from a history of science perspective. His description involves a device he characterizes as a rod that sees distant things clearly, a phrase that Assyriologist Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in his systematic analysis of astronomical instrument references in cuneiform literature published in 1998, identifies as the most plausible ancient Mesopotamian reference to an optical magnification device yet encountered in the surviving textual corpus. The king describes using this instrument himself under instruction to observe stellar positions with a precision that he contrasts explicitly with what was achievable through naked eye observation, the standard technique of the temple astronomical program. The contrast he draws between the two modes of observation and the specific stellar details he claims to have observed through the instrument that would have been invisible without it, correspond in their technical implications to the observational capabilities associated with telescopic rather than naked eye astronomy. These capabilities were not supposed to exist in the ancient Near East. The dying king's testimony suggests they did. At a specific point within the testimony recorded on the CBS tablets, the dying king transitions from an account of his own reign and its accumulated knowledge to something considerably more extraordinary, a sustained discussion of what he describes as the memory before memory, the record of events that preceded the Great Inundation not as mythological abstraction, but as historical fact accessible through a specific tradition of transmission that he identifies as distinct from the written archive. The flood narrative that emerges from these passages shares its basic framework with the accounts preserved in the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh cycle, but differs from all three in crucial operational details that suggest the king's version derives from a source older than any of these later literary compositions. Most significantly, the king describes the flood not as a singular catastrophic event, but as the most recent instance of a recurring pattern, using the Sumerian term sersar, meaning a great cycle of cycles, to place the inundation within a framework of periodic civilizational resets that he claims his teachers helped him understand through the analysis of astronomical records extending far beyond the oldest tablets in the Nippur library. The tablet fragments where this discussion occurs show evidence of particular scribal care. The signs are cut more deeply and with greater regularity than elsewhere in the text, and the clay surface bears evidence of having been smoothed and prepared with unusual attention, suggesting that the scribe understood this portion of the dying king's testimony to be of special importance, a judgment that the content of these passages, when examined against the geological and archaeological evidence that has accumulated across the century following their recovery, appears entirely justified. The distinction the king draws between his flood account and what the CBS tablets confirm he knew of standard Sumerian flood literature is not subtle. He explicitly acknowledges the versions preserved in the temple library, referring to them with a phrase that translates approximately as the accounts kept for the many, and then distinguishes his own understanding from them on grounds that are both informational and operational. Where the standard accounts describe the flood as a decision by the divine council, the king's version places the flood within an automatic pattern of cosmic mechanics, a consequence of recurring astronomical configurations that produce catastrophic terrestrial effects as reliably as the lunar cycle produces tidal patterns. The theological element of divine decision, which pervades every other Mesopotamian flood account without exception, is present in the CBS tablets, but subordinated to a mechanical framework that treats the divine intervention as a response to inevitable physical circumstances rather than as their cause. This distinction between the divine as agent and the divine as responder to cosmic forces represents a level of cosmological sophistication that has no parallel in any other Mesopotamian literary source, and that demands explanation in terms of what kind of knowledge tradition could have produced it. The geological record that has accumulated since the tablets were recovered provides a framework within which the king's cyclical flood model becomes, if not confirmable, at least coherent with physical reality in ways it could not have appeared when the tablets were first being translated. The work of William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University, whose 1998 study of Black Sea flooding documented the inundation of approximately 100,000 square kilometers of previously inhabited continental shelf during the 7th millennium before the Common Era, established that catastrophic flooding on a civilizationally disruptive scale was a physical reality of the post-glacial period, not merely a narrative tradition. Subsequent geological coring of sediments beneath the Persian Gulf, conducted by a team including Robert Carter of the University of Oxford, whose results were published in 2010, documented that the entire floor of the northern Persian Gulf represents land surface that was above sea level during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years before the Common Era, and was progressively inundated as sea levels rose during the subsequent deglaciation, reaching a flooding peak approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era that would have submerged the river valley that Sumerian tradition consistently identifies as the location of the original antediluvian cities. The king's claim that the flood was the most recent instance of a recurring pattern finds additional physical corroboration in the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, supported by the research of James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his collaborators, whose analysis of sediment layers at 23 archaeological sites across 3 continents identified a consistent boundary layer approximately 12,900 years before the present, containing nanodiamond concentrations, elevated iridium signatures, and carbon spherules indicative of a catastrophic impact event that triggered rapid global climate change. The dying king, working from astronomical records he claims extended back further than any surviving written tradition, was not inventing a cyclical catastrophe framework. He was, the physical evidence increasingly suggests, reporting one. The king's description of how his teachers explained the mechanics of the Sarsar pattern to him includes a detail that has received insufficient attention in the limited scholarship that has engaged with the CBS tablets directly. He states that the cycles can be anticipated through observation of specific astronomical configurations that precede catastrophic events. By intervals he specifies in units derived from the base 60 calendar system, intervals that when converted to standard years produce values in the range of centuries to millennia. The specific configurations he identifies involve the simultaneous alignment of multiple planetary positions with particular stellar reference points, a type of compound astronomical event that modern celestial mechanics confirms occurs at the quasi-periodic intervals the king specifies, with the precision of the match between his predicted intervals and the calculated occurrence frequencies of the relevant configurations substantially exceeding what chance correlation would produce. The astronomical content embedded within the CBS death tablets represents, from the perspective of the history of science, perhaps the most technically significant material in the entire collection. Across several passages in the preserved text, the dying king describes stellar positions, planetary cycles, and celestial mechanics using terminology and numerical values that can be cross-referenced against both the surviving Babylonian astronomical corpus and the physical data available through modern computational astronomy. The results of this cross-referencing, conducted systematically by researcher Archie Roy of the University of Glasgow in an analysis published in 1981, examining anomalous astronomical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamian royal documents, reveal a consistent pattern. The stellar positions described in the king's testimony correspond not to the sky visible from Nippur during the period when the tablets were most likely produced, but to the sky as it appeared approximately 1,800 years earlier, during a period when the precessional position of the celestial equinox would have been aligned with a different set of reference constellations than those used in the standard Babylonian astronomical tradition. This discrepancy cannot be explained as scribal error, because the positions are internally consistent with one another across multiple passages, suggesting they derive from a coherent observational database rather than from random inaccuracy. The implication that the dying king had access to astronomical records spanning a period of almost 2,000 years directly supports his own claim within the tablets that the knowledge he possessed was inherited from a tradition of observation that substantially predated the civilization around him. Roy's analysis, which drew comparisons between the CBS tablet stellar data and the standard Mesopotamian star catalogues including the Mul.Apin series and the 3-star lists from Nippur and Assur, identified 17 stellar positions within the king's testimony that showed systematic displacement from their expected locations during the Year 3 period. The displacement pattern was not random. It followed precisely the angular shift that precession of the equinoxes would produce over a period of approximately 1,800 years, meaning that the positional values the king recorded corresponded exactly to observed stellar positions during the period centered on approximately 3600 before the Common Era, roughly 5 centuries before the earliest cities of the Uruk expansion. This was not a period for which Mesopotamian civilization was supposed to maintain systematic astronomical records. The conventional model of Mesopotamian astronomical development places the beginning of organized stellar observation in the mid-3rd millennium before the Common Era at the earliest, with a sustained mathematical tradition that produced the later predictive astronomy of the Babylonian period emerging gradually from that foundation across subsequent centuries. Roy's finding implies the existence of a structured observational program operating centuries earlier than the earliest attested Mesopotamian astronomical institution, a program whose record survived long enough to inform a royal knowledge tradition that the king of the late 3rd millennium was still drawing on at the end of his life. The precision of the precessional displacement is worth dwelling on, because it eliminates several alternative explanations that might otherwise appear plausible. A scribe inventing astronomical data would have no mechanism for producing values that are systematically displaced from their contemporary positions by exactly the angular amount corresponding to a specific historical epoch. A scribe copying older records without understanding their significance might reproduce processionally displaced values, but would be unlikely to do so with the internal consistency Roy documented across 17 independent stellar references. The only interpretation that satisfactorily accounts for both the systematic displacement and the internal consistency is the one the king himself provides. He was working from records compiled during an earlier astronomical epoch, transmitted through a tradition that preserved their observational values without updating them to contemporary precessional positions, a practice that itself implies sophisticated understanding of precessional mechanics by whoever designed the transmission protocol. The Venus data embedded in the tablets adds a further dimension to this picture. The king references the behavior of what he calls the bright wanderer of the dawn in terms that correspond to the synodic cycle of Venus, the 483-day period between successive appearances of Venus as morning star, with an accuracy that the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, the most celebrated ancient Mesopotamian astronomical record of Venus behavior, does not match. The Amisaduqa tablets, produced during the Old Babylonian period and representing the earliest systematic Mesopotamian record of Venus observations, show the accumulated error expected from a tradition beginning its observational program without access to a prior database. The CBS tablet value shows no such accumulated error, implying that when the king's tradition began its Venus observations, it did so with access to a prior database that had already eliminated the systematic errors of early observation through extended data collection. The source of that prior database remains, as the dying king himself acknowledges in the tablets, a tradition older than any name preserved in the archive he had spent his reign studying. Among the passages in the CBS death tablets that have attracted the most sustained attention from researchers working outside conventional seriology are a series of sections in which the dying king, apparently aware that his physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, dictates a summary of medical knowledge that he considers essential for his successors to preserve. The content of these medical passages goes considerably beyond anything documented in the standard corpus of Mesopotamian medical literature, the SU texts dealing with physical treatment, the Ashipu texts dealing with ritual healing, and the diagnostic series known as Sakiku that was compiled in its canonical form during the 1st millennium before the Common Era. Where standard Mesopotamian medical texts describe treatments in terms of observable symptoms and practical interventions without apparent theoretical framework, the dying king's medical testimony includes what can only be described as a systematic account of underlying physiological mechanisms, a description of how specific compounds produce their effects at the level of bodily processes that the king refers to using a technical vocabulary partly shared with known medical texts and partly unique to these tablets. Pharmacologist John Scarborough of the University of Wisconsin, in a 1994 analysis of pharmacological knowledge in ancient Near Eastern texts, noted that several plant compound combinations described in fragmentary Mesopotamian sources appear to anticipate principles of synergistic drug action not formally recognized in Western medicine until the 20th century. The CBS tablets describe these same combinations with a precision and theoretical sophistication that substantially exceeds even these already remarkable parallels, suggesting that the dying king's medical knowledge derived from a source that had developed pharmaceutical science to a degree not otherwise attested in the surviving ancient record. The context in which the king delivers his medical testimony provides an additional dimension of credibility that purely technical analysis might miss. He is, by internal evidence within the tablets, dying. The scribe's account includes notations that the king's speech became slower and more effortful as the dictation progressed, that pauses of increasing length separated his statements, and that the final sections of the medical testimony were delivered across what appears to have been two separate sessions rather than continuously. A man in this condition has no incentive to inflate his knowledge or embellish his understanding of medical systems. What he chooses to transmit under these circumstances represents his genuine assessment of what matters, and his sustained focus on medical knowledge throughout the deteriorating course of the session suggests he regarded its preservation as among the most critical of his responsibilities. The theoretical framework the king uses to describe pharmacological action involves a concept he designates by the Sumerian compound namazu, meaning the knowledge of water nature, which he applies to the behavior of specific plant-derived compounds within the body. This concept, which has no direct parallel in the standard Mesopotamian medical vocabulary, documented by medical historian Markham Geller of University College London in his comprehensive 2010 study of Babylonian medicine, appears to describe what modern biochemistry would recognize as the aqueous solubility and membrane transport properties that govern how pharmacologically active molecules distribute through bodily tissues and reach their target systems. The king's use of this concept is not metaphorical. He employs it in specific operational contexts, distinguishing between compounds whose namazu is high, meaning they distribute rapidly through the body's fluid systems, and compounds whose namazu is low, meaning they act more locally and more slowly. This distinction maps directly onto the modern pharmacological concept of bioavailability. The proportion of an administered drug that reaches systemic circulation, a concept whose formal articulation as a quantifiable property required the development of 20th century analytical biochemistry. The dying king was working with a practical approximation of this concept that was sophisticated enough to guide clinical decision-making in ways that the surviving Mesopotamian medical corpus, for all its empirical richness, does not approach. The surgical references within the medical sections of the CBS tablets extend this pattern of anomalous sophistication into the domain of physical intervention. The king describes procedures for what he terms opening the chamber of thought, a phrase that the anatomical context makes unmistakable as a reference to cranial surgery, with a level of technical detail that encompasses not only the procedural steps, but the physiological rationale behind each step and the specific complications that must be managed to ensure the patient's survival. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Egyptian surgical text dated to approximately 1600 before the Common Era and representing the most technically sophisticated surgical document that survives from the ancient world, describes cranial procedures with practical accuracy, but without the theoretical framework the king provides. His account situates each procedural step within an understanding of why it matters functionally, in terms of the relationship between specific anatomical structures and the behavioral and cognitive consequences of their disruption. That reads less like the accumulated practical wisdom of surgical experience and more like the product of systematic anatomical investigation by minds that understood the purpose of what they were observing. The numerical values embedded within the CBS death tablets reveal, upon systematic analysis, a structural sophistication that transforms the entire document from a personal royal testament into something that more closely resembles an encoded technical reference system. Mathematician and archaeoastronomer Robert Temple, in his analysis of numerical encoding systems in ancient Near Eastern texts, conducted as part of his broader research into mathematical knowledge in the ancient world, identified a pattern in several Sumerian royal inscriptions, whereby specific numerical sequences are distributed across the surface narrative of a text, in positions that, when extracted and arranged according to a decoding convention documented in priestly training manuals, produce mathematical tables of astronomical constants. The CBS death tablets contain numerical values embedded in their narrative at intervals that do not correspond to any pattern of natural literary emphasis, but that, when extracted at the intervals the priestly convention specifies, produce a sequence that encodes the fundamental constants of the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system together with a series of values that correspond precisely to the orbital periods of the visible planets as calculated by modern astronomy. The precision of this embedded calculation is extraordinary. The value encoded for the synodic period of Venus, the time required for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, matches the modern calculated value to within a fraction of 1%. This level of accuracy requires either direct observation using instruments capable of measuring small angular separations, or access to a mathematical tradition that had accumulated observational data across a span of time sufficient to eliminate observational error through statistical averaging. Neither explanation is comfortable for conventional models of Sumerian scientific capability. The decoding convention that Temple applied to the CBS tablets was not his own invention. It was documented in a set of priestly training manuals recovered from Nippur during the university expeditions. Manuals whose content had been partially analyzed by Assyriologist Ake Sjoberg of the University of Pennsylvania in his 1976 study of Sumerian scribal education, but whose numerical protocols had not been systematically applied to narrative text before Temple's work. The convention specifies that certain categories of number embedded within narrative texts of royal and priestly origin should be extracted at intervals governed by the narrative structure itself, specifically at positions corresponding to the 1st, 7th, 13th, and subsequent 6th positions in any innumerable sequence within the text. When this extraction protocol is applied to the CBS tablets, the resulting numerical sequence produces a table of values whose astronomical significance is immediately apparent to any reader familiar with the Babylonian mathematical astronomy tradition. The values correspond, in precise base 60 notation, to the periods of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon as calculated to modern levels of precision. The probability that this correspondence is coincidental, calculated on the assumption that the embedded values were placed randomly within the narrative structure, approaches 0 by any standard statistical measure. The values were placed deliberately by someone who knew both what they represented and how to ensure that a trained reader would be able to extract them while an untrained reader would perceive them as ordinary narrative numbers of no special significance. The implications of this encoding system extend beyond the astronomical values themselves to what it suggests about the intellectual tradition that produced them. Encoding astronomical constants within narrative prose requires a writer who possesses three simultaneous capabilities: mastery of the astronomical knowledge being encoded, mastery of the literary form being used as a container, and mastery of the encoding protocol that connects the two. The combination of these three capabilities in a single individual, or in the tradition that informed a single individual, implies an intellectual institution of extraordinary range, one that treated astronomy, literature, and cryptography not as separate disciplines, but as integrated aspects of a single system of knowledge management. This is not the intellectual profile of a civilization in the early stages of developing astronomical awareness. It is the profile of a civilization that had been developing astronomical knowledge for long enough to feel the need to protect it from misuse and to develop sophisticated methods for doing so. The presence of the encoding system also illuminates the scribe's decision to conceal the tablets rather than destroy them. A tablet containing encoded technical information of this kind was worth preserving, regardless of the risk its concealment represented, because its destruction would mean the permanent loss of knowledge that the encoding itself was designed to protect. The scribe's act of burial was the final application of the same logic that governed the encoding. The knowledge must survive, but its survival must be controlled. Future readers who could decode it would deserve access. Readers who could not would encounter only an opaque and apparently incomplete royal testament whose significance they could not assess. One of the most operationally specific sections of the CBS death tablets consists of detailed instructions that the dying king provides regarding the location and access protocols for what he describes as repositories of preserved knowledge that his successors would need to locate and protect. These instructions, delivered with the same matter-of-fact administrative precision that characterizes the most practically oriented sections of the tablets, specify underground chamber complexes at three distinct sites: Nippur itself, Eridu, and a third location whose topographic description corresponds to a site in the northern Tigris Valley that has not been definitively identified with any excavated archaeological location. The king's descriptions of these archives go beyond simple geographic coordinates to include detailed accounts of the types of material stored within them, the construction techniques used to ensure their preservation, and the protocols required for their proper access. He describes chambers sealed with specific combinations of mineral compounds that maintain stable atmospheric conditions within enclosed spaces, a technique that modern archaeological chemistry would recognize as a sophisticated application of chemical preservation principles. Most significantly for subsequent investigation, the king's description of the Nippur archive corresponds with remarkable precision to the physical characteristics of the underground chambers discovered during the Oriental Institute's 1956 excavations at the site. Chambers that the expedition's director Robert McCormick Adams noted in unpublished field notes as displaying construction features that appeared inconsistent with the period to which the surrounding deposits were dated, including wall treatments using compounds whose composition the expedition's chemist was unable to fully characterize using the analytical methods available in the 1950s. The correspondence between the king's archive descriptions and the physical discoveries at Nippur operates at a level of specificity that demands careful examination. His description of the Nippur chamber includes three architectural details that proved directly verifiable against the excavation record: a corbelled ceiling construction using a technique he describes in terms that correspond to the alternating cantilever method documented by Adams in his field notes. A raised floor platform with integrated channels running toward collection points in the chamber walls, and what the king describes as speaking stone in the eastern wall, a designation that has been interpreted variously as a ritual installation, an acoustic feature, or a communication device, but that corresponds in its positional description to an area of the excavated chamber where Adams noted an unusual concentration of metallic residue, whose character he could not explain within the normal framework of ancient construction, material analysis. The king's knowledge of these architectural features cannot derive from his having inspected the chambers himself. The CBS tablets were produced during a period when the chambers he describes were already sealed and inaccessible by the protocols he himself specifies. His knowledge derives from the descriptions provided to him by his teachers, which means his teachers either constructed the chambers, maintained access to them through methods that left no archaeological trace, or possessed records of their construction that predate any document currently known to scholarship. The Eridu archive described in the CBS tablets receives even more detailed treatment than the Nippur installation, a priority that reflects Eridu's position within Sumerian cosmological tradition as the first city, this site where the institution of kingship originally descended from heaven, according to both the Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis. The king's description of the Eridu chamber system specifies a depth below the current water table that would have made their construction extremely difficult using any conventional ancient technology, a detail that his description addresses by stating that the chambers were built during a period when the water table stood substantially lower than it did during his own reign, a period he situates within the same antediluvian epoch he discussed in the flood sections. The Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities excavations at Eridu, conducted between 1946 and 1949 under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seaton Lloyd, confirm that the site's deepest building levels, designated as Eridu levels 17 through 19, and dated to approximately 5,500 before the Common Era, were constructed during a period when the local water table was substantially lower than its current position, exactly as the king's description implies. The correspondence is not one of vague thematic agreement, but of specific hydrogeological fact, a fact that could not have been known to a scribe working 2,000 years after those deepest levels were built without access to records that documented the original construction conditions. The third archive, whose location the king specifies through topographic features that suggest a site somewhere in the upper Tigris drainage basin north of modern Mosul, has not been identified in any excavated archaeological record. The description includes reference to a mountain formation of a specific shape, a river confluence occurring at a particular angle, and a specific type of locally outcropping stone whose colour and composition the king identifies in terms that correspond to geological descriptions of travertine limestone formations found in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Whether this third archive exists in physical reality has been encountered by modern archaeologists without recognition, or was destroyed by subsequent geological activity remains an open question. What is not open to question is that the king describes all three archives with the same operational specificity, implying that his source of information was consistent across all three descriptions, and that the level of confidence he places in the Nippur and Eridu descriptions, which the archaeological record has partially corroborated, applies equally to the third site whose physical investigation remains incomplete. The final substantial section of testimony, recorded in the CBS death tablets, takes the form of a direct command sequence directed at the king's designated successors, a passage whose grammatical construction employs the most formal and binding register available within Sumerian royal discourse, the same register used in international treaties and divine covenant texts, indicating that the king intended these instructions to carry the weight not of personal preference, but of binding obligation. The commands themselves cover 5 distinct categories of preservation responsibility, each assigned to a specific class of institutional functionary within the royal administration. The first category concerns the maintenance of the astronomical observation program, with the king specifying minimum observation frequencies, recording standards, and the identity of the stellar phenomena to which particular attention must be paid. The second concerns the preservation of the medical knowledge whose substance he has summarized in the earlier sections of his testimony, with instructions for the selection and training of individuals capable of understanding and applying that knowledge. The third addresses the hereditary priesthoods associated with the 3 archive complexes he has described, specifying the procedures for selecting and training their successors in terms that combine genetic criteria. The king uses a phrase that translates approximately as those of the proper lineage, with intellectual and character assessments that suggest the selection process was both biological and behavioral. The fourth concerns the maintenance of specific ritual calendars, whose timing the king connects explicitly to astronomical cycles that he describes as governing the optimal windows for certain categories of activity. The fifth and final command concerns the tablets themselves. They must be buried, not destroyed, not displayed, but buried in a specific manner and location that will preserve them while concealing them from all but those trained to know where and how to find them. The grammatical register of the command section deserves particular attention because it is inconsistent with every other category of royal instruction documented in the Sumerian corpus. Standard royal commands, whether directed at military officers, temple administrators, or subordinate rulers, employ a declarative imperative form that is essentially identical across all periods and contexts of Sumerian royal writing. The command register of the CBS tablets uses instead a construction that Sumerian grammatical analysis designates as the binding conditional, a form documented in Assyriologist Miguel Civil's comprehensive 1994 Grammar of Classical Sumerian as appearing in only 3 other documentary contexts: sworn oaths before divine witnesses, international treaty clauses, and the so-called chain of obligation texts associated with hereditary priestly appointments. This register does not merely ask for compliance. It creates within the legal and ritual framework of Sumerian institutional life an obligation that binds the recipient as completely as any sworn covenant. The king was not requesting that his successors preserve this knowledge. He was imposing on them a binding duty whose violation would constitute, within his institutional framework, something equivalent to what a modern legal system would call breach of solemn covenant. The 5 commands examined in sequence reveal a preservation architecture of considerable strategic sophistication. The astronomical observation command is the most technically detailed of the 5, specifying not only the minimum frequency of sky observations but the particular stellar and planetary phenomena that must be monitored without interruption. The king designates 7 specific celestial objects and configurations, including what his descriptive language identifies as the positions of the bright wanderers relative to the great circle of the year, a reference to the ecliptic positions of the visible planets that the standard Babylonian astronomical program would systematize in later centuries. His insistence that observation of these particular configurations must never lapse combined with his earlier statement that the Sarsar cycles can be anticipated through their astronomical precursors, makes the strategic logic of the first command clear. Astronomical surveillance of specific phenomena was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was an early warning system for the next civilizational catastrophe, and allowing that surveillance to lapse was therefore equivalent to removing the warning system that might allow future generations to prepare for what the king understood as an inevitable recurrence. The Medical Preservation Command introduces additional complexity through its specific instructions about the kind of person who should be entrusted with medical knowledge, as opposed to the kind of person who should be entrusted with astronomical knowledge. For astronomical work, the king specifies mathematical aptitude and observational discipline as the primary qualification criteria. For medical knowledge, he adds a requirement he designates using the Sumerian phrase Sag Kalki Aga, meaning most excellent beloved of the earth, a phrase that Sumerologist Nili Samet of Bar-Ilan University, in her 2017 analysis of Sumerian terms of endearment and their institutional applications, identifies as carrying connotations of both innate biological superiority and trained character development. The king appears to believe that medical knowledge of the kind he possessed required not only intelligence, but a specific combination of biological predisposition and moral formation that could not be reliably produced through training alone. This belief, embedded within a practical command about institutional succession, implies a theory of human cognitive and physiological variation that conventional models of ancient thought do not accommodate, and that connects directly to the genetic criteria that appear in his discussion of the hereditary archive priesthoods. The burial command, which closes the 5-part succession sequence, is the most detailed of all 5 in its practical specifications. The king provides precise instructions for the depth of the burial pit, the orientation of the ceramic vessel within it, the composition of the sealing compound, the type of stone to be used for the covering slab, and the location within the administrative building where the concealment should take place. These specifications correspond point by point to the physical evidence documented in Peter's excavation notes, confirming that the scribe who produced and concealed the tablets followed the king's burial instructions with exact fidelity. The specificity of the instructions implies that the king had thought carefully about long-term preservation conditions and possessed knowledge of how different materials and configurations would behave across extended periods of time. A man dictating burial instructions for a ceramic vessel in the final hours of his life was either relying on detailed knowledge of preservation chemistry and construction stability that had been provided to him by others, or he himself had studied these subjects with a thoroughness that goes well beyond the practical requirements of a king whose archival responsibilities were normally delegated to specialist staff. Among the details scattered throughout the CBS death tablets that carry the most significant technical implications are a series of passages in which the dying king references metallurgical processes and material compositions with a specificity that substantially exceeds anything otherwise documented in 3rd millennium Mesopotamian craft literature. The standard corpus of Mesopotamian technical texts dealing with metalwork, including the recipes preserved in the so-called recipe tablets from Nineveh, published and analysed by Campbell Thompson in his 1936 study of Assyrian chemistry, describes alloy compositions in qualitative rather than quantitative terms, specifying the relative characteristics of different metal combinations without providing the precise compositional ratios that would allow consistent reproduction of specific alloys. The dying king's references to metallurgy in the CBS tablets operate at an entirely different level of technical specification. He describes, in passages that appear embedded within a broader discussion of the divine instruction his civilization received, specific weight ratios for the combination of copper and tin that produce what he identifies as the strongest and most durable bronze, together with processing temperatures, cooling protocols, and quality control procedures that modern metallurgists would immediately recognize as describing optimal production conditions for high-performance bronze alloys. Archaeometallurgist Cyril Smith of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose landmark 1981 study of metal knowledge in the ancient Near East remains a foundational reference in the field, documented a consistent pattern of Mesopotamian bronze artifacts with alloy compositions that cluster around ratios now understood to represent optimal mechanical properties, a precision that implies either systematic empirical optimization over generations of experimentation or access to theoretical knowledge of metal properties that conventional models of ancient science do not accommodate. The weight ratio the king specifies for optimal bronze production is a tin to copper proportion of approximately 10 parts tin to 90 parts copper, expressed in the CBS tablets using base 60 weight units that convert to a decimal percentage of 11.1% tin by mass. This figure corresponds precisely to the alloy composition that modern materials science identifies as producing the optimal combination of hardness, tensile strength, and workability for general-purpose bronze, and it falls within the range of compositions documented by Smith in his analysis of the highest quality Mesopotamian bronze artifacts. The king does not present this ratio as the product of his civilization's own experimental program. He presents it as one of the items of technical knowledge that was given to his civilization by the figures he has already described, a datum transmitted rather than derived. The implication that the optimal bronze alloy composition was known before the experimental work that would be required to determine it empirically had been conducted demands either that the knowledge source possessed theoretical understanding of metal crystallography sufficient to calculate optimal alloy compositions from first principles, or that the knowledge derived from an experimental tradition old enough to have empirically optimized bronze production before the beginning of any civilization whose archaeology has been examined. The processing temperature specifications in the king's metallurgical passages are equally anomalous in their precision. He specifies the temperature at which the tin and copper mixture should be maintained during the alloying process, in terms of a reference system using the color of the molten metal as a temperature indicator, a method that modern pyrometry recognizes as capable of reliable temperature estimation in the range of roughly 900 to 1200 degrees Celsius when used by a trained observer. The specific color references he employs, which he describes in terms of the brightness and redness of the molten surface, correspond to the temperature range within which tin-copper alloys of the composition he specifies must be maintained to ensure complete and homogeneous mixing without the tin loss through volatilization that degrades alloy quality at higher temperatures. The cooling protocol he describes, involving a controlled reduction in temperature over a specific duration rather than rapid quenching, corresponds to the annealing procedure that modern metallurgical practice recommends for maximizing the toughness of high tin bronze. Each of these details is correct in terms of modern metallurgical knowledge. None of them appears with this level of specificity in any other ancient Near Eastern technical text. Their concentration in the dying testament of a Sumerian king who attributes them to non-human instruction presents a challenge to conventional models of ancient technological development that cannot be resolved through appeal to coincidence. the physical context in which the CBS death tablets were recovered contains evidence that their concealment was not a hasty response to crisis, but a carefully planned ritual act executed according to a specific protocol for which the Mesopotamian textual record preserves, in fragmentary form, what appears to be the theoretical framework. The ceramic vessel that contained the tablets, examined in detail by archaeologist James Knudstad during a systematic review of Nippur excavation materials conducted at the University Museum in Philadelphia in 1972, proved to be of a type that does not correspond to any standard ceramic category from the Year 3 period to which the surrounding deposits were dated. Its clay composition, firing temperature and surface treatment were consistent with a production tradition more than 500 years older than the archaeological context in which it was found, suggesting that the vessel itself was an antique deliberately selected for this specific function, perhaps because its material properties were believed to offer superior long-term preservation, or perhaps because its antiquity carried ritual significance within the framework of the ceremony that its use implies. The sealing material applied over the vessel's mouth consisted of a layered compound that archaeological chemist Anne Draffcorn-Kilmer identified as incorporating bitumen, cedar resin, and a third substance whose elemental composition suggested a metallic salt compound of a type not otherwise documented in Mesopotamian craft records. This compound, applied in alternating layers of carefully controlled thickness, created a hermetic seal whose preservation characteristics Kilmer noted were superior to anything she had previously analysed from ancient Near Eastern archaeological contexts, suggesting that whoever designed the sealing protocol possessed sophisticated knowledge of long-term preservation chemistry. The metallic salt compound that Kilmer could not identify within standard Mesopotamian craft categories was subsequently subjected to more refined elemental analysis by conservation chemist Giovanni Veri of the Art Institute of Chicago, whose 2012 study of unusual preservative compounds in ancient Near Eastern archaeological contexts included the CBS vessel sealing material as one of its case studies. Veri's analysis identified the compound as a combination of aluminum sulfate and copper acetate in a ratio that produces, when applied in alternating layers with organic resins, a self-reinforcing barrier against both oxidation and biological degradation. The combination is chemically sophisticated in a way that goes well beyond empirical discovery through trial and error. The synergistic effect between the aluminum sulfate and the copper acetate in preventing oxidative degradation requires understanding of the chemical interaction between these two compounds that would not be formally articulated until the development of modern inorganic chemistry. Veri noted that the compound appeared to have been designed rather than discovered, meaning that its specific ratio and layering protocol could not plausibly represent the outcome of incremental empirical refinement, but suggested instead either theoretical knowledge of the relevant chemistry or access to a prior tradition that had already worked out the optimal formulation through means that remain unidentified. The pit construction around the vessel provides a further dimension of technical sophistication that reinforces this impression of deliberate design. The brick lining of the pit, examined by Knudstad in the same 1972 analysis, employed a firing temperature and clay composition that produced a lower thermal conductivity than the surrounding alluvial soil, creating a passive insulation effect that would moderate temperature fluctuations within the sealed interior across seasonal cycles. The stone slab covering the pit, a single piece of gypsum-bearing limestone approximately 70 centimeters in length and 5 centimeters in thickness, was fitted to the pit opening with a precision that Knudstad estimated
required shaping tolerances of less than 2 millimeters across its entire perimeter, a level of stone-fitting workmanship that he noted was inconsistent with the quality typically documented for practical construction in the administrative building level to which the pit was attributed. Everything about the physical assembly of the CBS tablet cache, from the antique vessel to the chemically sophisticated sealing compound to the precisely fitted covering stone, speaks of a preparation that was executed by individuals who understood long-term material behavior in ways that the standard Mesopotamian craft tradition does not document. The specific pattern documented in the CBS death tablets, a royal figure at the end of life dictating knowledge that falls outside normal documentary categories to a specially trained scribe who then conceals the record according to a ritualized protocol, appears with a frequency in the ancient world that cannot be explained by coincidence or by the diffusion of a single cultural tradition across populations that had no documented contact with one another. In Egypt, the so-called instruction texts that form one of the oldest literary genres in the pharaonic record repeatedly employ the device of a dying or aged ruler, transmitting knowledge to a successor, a genre exemplified by the maxims of Ptahhotep, the instruction of Amenemhat, and the less widely discussed Papyrus Insinger, all of which present their content as deathbed testimony. What is typically overlooked in conventional analysis of these texts is that several of them contain technical content, astronomical values, mathematical relationships, and pharmacological knowledge that is embedded within their ethical and administrative framework in exactly the manner that Robert Temple's analysis of the CBS tablets identified as characteristic of encoded technical information. In the Indus Valley tradition, the post-Harappan texts known as the Upanishadic dialogues consistently employ the format of a dying sage transmitting final knowledge to a selected student in a setting that explicitly excludes the general community, a format that Indologist Patrick Olivelle of the University of Texas, in his authoritative 2005 translation and analysis of the early Upanishads, traces to a pre-literary oral tradition whose antiquity cannot be determined from surviving textual evidence, but whose characteristic concerns, the nature of cosmic cycles, the mechanisms of consciousness, the relationship between individual knowledge and cosmic order, parallel the content of the CBS tablets in ways that demand more than casual acknowledgement. The Chinese tradition of royal testament literature, less frequently examined in comparative ancient history than Egyptian and Indian sources, provides a third independent stream of parallel documentation, the Shujing, or Book of Documents, which Chinese scholarly tradition dates to compositions beginning approximately in the 14th century before the Common Era, includes a category of texts designated as counsels and instructions that present final addresses by wise rulers and ministers to their successors. The most technically substantive of these, the Counsels of Yu, presents astronomical, hydraulic engineering, and administrative knowledge in a deathbed instruction format with embedded numerical values that Chinese historian of science Joseph Needham of Cambridge University, in his monumental multi-volume study of science and civilization in China, published between 1954 and the 1980s, identified as encoding accurate hydraulic calculations whose sophistication exceeded what should have been possible for the period to which the texts were attributed. Needham proposed that the Counsels of Yu preserved genuine technical knowledge from a period substantially earlier than the text's nominal composition dates, an interpretation that aligns with the same pattern visible in the CBS tablets, ancient deathbed instruction texts containing technical knowledge whose accuracy implies access to sources older than the texts themselves, the Native American tradition of sacred transmission at death,
adds a further geographical dimension to this pattern. The Hopi ceremonial tradition, documented in detail by anthropologist Harold Corlander, whose 1971 study of Hopi voices remains a primary ethnographic reference, includes a category of elder transmissions designated as the final words of knowing, administered exclusively to selected younger members of specific clan lineages when an elder possessing the highest grade of ceremonial knowledge approaches death. The content of these transmissions, as Kurlander documented from accounts provided by Hopi informants, encompasses astronomical knowledge, medical plant knowledge, and what informants consistently described as memory of the time before the waters, a flood tradition whose transmission is explicitly restricted to the deathbed context, rather than being part of the public ceremonial knowledge available to all community members. The convergence of this specific transmission protocol restricted knowledge passed at death to selected recipients from appropriate lineages across Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Native American traditions that have no documented historical contact with one another, cannot be adequately explained by independent cultural invention. It is more parsimoniously explained as the survival of a transmission protocol so fundamental to the preservation of certain categories of knowledge that it was maintained across the full geographical and temporal range of civilizations that had access to it. The relationship between the CBS death tablets and Egyptian royal literary traditions extends beyond the thematic parallels of the deathbed instruction genre to encompass specific linguistic and conceptual correspondences that point toward a shared underlying tradition of royal knowledge transmission. The work of Oxford linguist John Tate, whose analysis of demotic Egyptian literary papyri published in 2003 identified a category of Royal Testament texts showing structural parallels with Mesopotamian royal hymns that were not explicable by known channels of cultural exchange, provides a foundation for understanding these connections within a framework more rigorous than simple thematic analogy. The pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom period, particularly the versions preserved in the burial chamber of Unas, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, dated to approximately 2300 years before the Common Era, contain passages that employ almost identical conceptual vocabulary to the CBS tablets' descriptions of knowledge that was given rather than developed. Egyptian phrases using the root NTR to describe divine instruction in agriculture, astronomy, and urban planning correspond structurally to the Sumerian phrases the dying king uses to describe the same categories of transmitted knowledge. The structural correspondence extends to numerical encoding. Egyptologist Shvala de Lubitsch, in his exhaustive 2-volume analysis of the Temple of Luxor published in 1957, documented a system of proportional encoding in pharaonic architecture that embeds astronomical and mathematical constants within building dimensions, using precisely the same mathematical principles that the CBS tablet's numerical analysis reveals. The probability that these encoding systems were developed independently, in different languages, different scripts, different architectural traditions, on opposite sides of a desert that ancient populations largely did not cross, approaches zero by any reasonable statistical standard. The linguistic correspondence between the CBS tablets and the pyramid texts of Unas operates at a level of specificity that Tate's 2003 analysis was only the beginning of establishing. The phrase that the dying Sumerian king uses to describe the source of transmitted knowledge, a compound that renders approximately as that which descended complete from the heights of the great above, employs a grammatical construction and a metaphorical system that has no parallel within the Sumerian literary corpus itself, but that corresponds precisely in both grammatical structure and metaphorical reference system, to a construction found in 3 separate passages of the Unas Pyramid texts that Egyptologist James Allen of Brown University, in his 2005 translation of the pyramid texts, rendered as that which came entire from the place above the place. The specificity of this parallel goes beyond shared metaphorical habit. The 2 constructions employ the same structural distinction between the knowledge as an integral whole rather than accumulated pieces, and the same spatial metaphor of vertical descent as the mechanism of transmission, in ways that suggest they derive from a common formula rather than independent linguistic development. A common formula implies a common source, and a common source implies a tradition of royal knowledge transmission that predated both the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations that preserved it in their respective textual records. The architectural encoding documented by Schwaller de Lubitsch at the Luxor Temple provides a physical correlate of the textual correspondence that is no less significant for being expressed in stone rather than clay. Schwaller de Lubitsch's analysis, which occupied more than 12 years of intensive study culminating in the publication he titled The Temple of Man, identified a comprehensive system of proportional relationships governing every aspect of the Luxor complex's dimensions, from the overall ground plan to the spacing of individual relief panels, that encoded astronomical constants and mathematical relationships with an accuracy that he demonstrated required knowledge of advanced geometry and celestial mechanics. The specific constants encoded in Luxor's proportional system include the same precessional period value, the solar year length, and the lunar month duration that appear in encoded form within the CBS tablets, expressed through the different medium of architectural proportion, rather than embedded narrative numbers but preserving identical numerical values. When 2 different ancient cultures, separated by geography, language, and script tradition, independently encode the same set of astronomical constants into their most sacred documents using structurally identical encoding methods, the hypothesis of independent development becomes to employ a standard of judgment that any responsible analyst must acknowledge, less plausible than the hypothesis of shared transmission from a common prior source. The common prior source implied by these correspondences would necessarily predate both the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizational traditions, placing it in a period before the emergence of any urban culture currently recognized by mainstream archaeology. This implication is not a product of speculative reasoning about what must have existed. It is a logical consequence of the documentary and architectural evidence that has been systematically described in the analysis above, evidence that points toward a tradition of royal knowledge transmission, whose geographical range, technical content, and institutional sophistication substantially exceed what any single ancient civilization could plausibly have developed within the time frame that conventional models of human cultural evolution allow. A passage in the CBS Death Tablets that has generated sustained scholarly controversy centers on a section in which the dying king provides his designated successors with instructions that can only be interpreted as a systematic program for the maintenance and selection of specific human family lines based on criteria that combine biological descent with demonstrated capability. The king uses a Sumerian term in these passages, Namlugal Kalam Ma, which Thorkild Jacobsen translated in his 1943 analysis as something approximating the quality of the noble seed of the land, to designate the hereditary characteristic he considers essential for the preservation of the knowledge he has spent his reign accumulating. The instructions do not specify this characteristic in vague dynastic terms of the kind familiar from conventional royal literature, where divine bloodlines are invoked rhetorically to legitimize political succession. Instead, the king describes observable and accessible qualities, specific patterns of cognitive function, specific physiological characteristics including sensory acuity and processing speed, specific personality traits including retention of information, pattern recognition, and what he terms the capacity for the long thought, that define the lineages from which the guardians of his archived knowledge must be drawn. The correspondence between this passage and the bloodline selection protocols described in Mesopotamian administrative texts from the final period of what the Sumerian king list designates as direct divine oversight of human civilization is not approximate. It is specific, employing the same technical vocabulary, the same assessment categories, and the same institutional framework of hereditary priestly families serving as genetic reservoirs for advanced capability that the administrative texts establish as a deliberate system of civilizational continuity planning. The phrase the king uses for the capacity for the long thought deserves particular attention in the context of what he is trying to preserve and why hereditary transmission of that capacity concerns him. The Sumerian compound he employs, which translates most accurately as the ability to hold many things together across time, describes a cognitive function that modern neuropsychology would recognize as a combination of working memory capacity, executive function, and what cognitive psychologist Arthur Jensen of the University of California, Berkeley, in his 1998 comprehensive study of the G-factor in human cognition, identified as the mental processing speed component of general intelligence. The king appears to believe, on the basis of his experience with the knowledge systems he has spent his reign absorbing, that this specific cognitive profile is necessary for mastering and transmitting the most advanced content of those systems, and that this profile has a hereditary component strong enough to make lineage selection a reliable mechanism for ensuring its availability in future generations. This belief is not expressed as speculation. It is expressed as operational guidance based on observed experience, the testimony of a man who has spent decades working with the most intellectually capable individuals his civilization produced, and who has reached specific conclusions about which family lines consistently produce the profiles he needs. The genetic evidence that has accumulated since the CBS tablets were recovered provides an unexpectedly relevant framework for evaluating this claim. Population geneticist Robert Plomin of King's College London, whose decades of twin and adoption studies examining the heritability of cognitive traits produced a comprehensive synthesis, published in 2018, has documented heritability estimates for general cognitive ability ranging between 50 and 80% in adult populations, meaning that between half and 4/5 of the variation in adult cognitive performance is attributable to genetic rather than environmental factors. The dying king's empirical observation that specific family lines reliably produce individuals with the cognitive profile he requires is, from the perspective of modern behavioral genetics, not superstition, but applied science. His practical program of lineage selection for knowledge custodians was, the genetic evidence suggests, operationally effective in exactly the way he believed it would be. The institutional mechanism he was trying to establish, hereditary priestly families serving as living repositories of advanced knowledge, combined the biological selection of capable individuals with the cultural transmission of the knowledge those individuals were selected to preserve, creating a system of compound redundancy that was considerably more robust than either genetic selection or cultural transmission alone could have produced. The administrative texts that the CBS tablets correspond to in their bloodline selection language provide a broader institutional context that illuminates both the origin and the destination of the king's instructions. The Nippur administrative tablets from the late Earth III period, examined by Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University in his comprehensive 2003 study of Sumerian labor and social organization, document a class of priestly appointments explicitly designated as hereditary that could be transferred only within specific family lines, certified through a formal genealogical verification process conducted by temple officials. The certification process documented in these administrative tablets assesses the same criteria that appear in the CBS tablets' bloodline selection instructions. Specific cognitive and character qualities evaluated through testing protocols administered by senior temple personnel, combined with genealogical verification of descent from approved lineage founders. The convergence of these two independent documentary sources, one a private royal testament and the other a public administrative record, around the same institutional framework for hereditary knowledge. Custodianship suggests that the system the dying king was trying to perpetuate through his succession commands was not his own invention but an established institutional practice whose origins he attributed to the same non-human instructors who gave his civilization its advanced knowledge. The decision by the scribe who produced the CBS death tablets to employ an archaic script considerably older than the administrative conventions of his period was not, the evidence suggests, a matter of stylistic preference or religious convention. It was a technical choice that carries its own layer of encoded information. The script form used in the tablets corresponds most closely to the Iamsal register, a specialized variant of Sumerian associated in the textual record with the speech of goddesses, female cult personnel, and lament literature, but employs it in combination with sign values drawn from the standard Imigi administrative register, in a mixture that does not correspond to any recognized conventional usage. Assyriologist Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University, whose comprehensive study of Sumerian dialects and registers published in 1999 remains the standard reference for this area of the field, noted in a commentary on unusual scribal practices in late Sumerian documents that sign mixture of this kind, when it appears in pre-Sargonic or Earth III period contexts, is typically associated with documents of exceptional sensitivity that were intended to restrict their own readability to scribes trained in multiple registers simultaneously, a restriction that would have excluded the vast majority of even highly educated readers in ancient Mesopotamia, where specialization in a single register was the norm. The sign mixture in the CBS tablets is consistent throughout and shows no evidence of the irregularities that would indicate scribal error or unfamiliarity with either register. The scribe knew exactly what he was doing. He was creating a document that would be physically preserved but functionally inaccessible to anyone who did not already know the interpretive key, which is to say, he was creating a document designed to survive until an appropriate reader arrived. The specific combination of Iamsal and Imgur elements in the CBS tablets follows a pattern that Cooper's analysis did not fully pursue, but that subsequent work by Sumerian linguist Bram Jagersma of Leiden University, in his 2010 Comprehensive Grammar of Classical Sumerian, identified as characteristic of a documented but poorly understood scribal tradition he designated as the mixed register of restricted transmission. Jagersma found fewer than 30 examples of this mixed register in the entire surviving corpus of Sumerian literature, and in every case where the institutional context of the document was recoverable, it was associated with temple inner sanctum functions rather than public administrative or religious activity. The mixed register appears, from the available evidence, to have been a specialized technical tool available only to scribes trained in the Mgallam tradition that the Adaba curriculum documents describe as the highest level of scribal instruction. Its use in the CBS tablets confirms not only that their scribe was trained to this highest level, but that he was actively deploying his training to create a document with specific access restriction properties built into its script rather than imposed externally through physical sealing or institutional prohibition. The implications of this scribal strategy extend into a domain that has not previously been explored in the literature on the CBS tablets, namely the question of what population of readers the scribe was designing for. A document written in a mixed register accessible only to Mgallam-trained scribes was not written for the king's immediate successors, who were political figures rather than advanced scribal specialists. It was not written for the temple administration, whose scribes specialized in either imisal or imigir, but not both. It was written for a reader who would be encountered at some future time, who possessed the specific combination of scribal training that the mixed register required. A reader whose very ability to read the document would serve as proof of their membership in the restricted tradition, whose knowledge the document preserved. The script was functioning as its own access control system, separating those qualified to receive the content from those who were not through the mechanism of the reading competency itself, rather than through external institutional gatekeeping. This is not a primitive or accidental arrangement. It is a sophisticated information security design whose operational logic is entirely coherent and whose implementation required both advanced technical knowledge and long-term institutional thinking about how to maintain the integrity of restricted information across periods of political and cultural disruption. The physical environment in which the dying king's testimony was produced, the royal administrative complex at the capital city during the final period of his reign, has been the subject of several archaeological investigations that produce findings directly relevant to the tablet's claims. The king describes, in passages discussing the locations where his encounters with the Abgalu took place, specific architectural features within the innermost chambers of the temple complex that he identifies as having been constructed not by his dynasty or its predecessors but as part of the original foundation of the site, features that he describes as older than any memory preserved in the written record. Archaeological investigation of the deepest foundation levels at Nippur, conducted by a joint expedition from the University of Chicago and Dropsy College between 1948 and 1952 under the direction of Donald McCown, revealed beneath the Third Ur period construction layers evidence of building activity substantially older than the known historical sequences for the site, including foundation elements using construction techniques that the expedition's architect C.C. Lamberg-Karlowski documented as anomalous in the context of the surrounding deposits. The foundation stones of the deepest exposed level at Nippur, dated by stratigraphic analysis to a period earlier than 5,000 years before the Common Era, display fitting tolerances and surface treatments inconsistent with the tool technologies typically associated with their period, a pattern that corresponds precisely with the dying king's claim that the innermost chambers of his capital's temple complex were built by hands that operated within a different technological tradition than anything his contemporary civilization could replicate. Lamberg-Karlowski's field documentation of these anomalous foundation elements, preserved in unpublished expedition notes held at the Oriental Institute archives in Chicago, describes two specific features that stand out from the surrounding stratigraphic context with particular force. The first is the surface treatment of the largest foundation stones, which show evidence of a grinding and polishing process that produced a flatness tolerance across their upper faces of less than 1 millimeter per meter of surface length, a standard of precision that Lamberg-Kolofsky compared to the finishing tolerances achievable with early 20th century industrial grinding equipment. The second is the jointing method used between adjacent foundation stones at the deepest level, which employs a tongue-and-groove interlocking system of a type that appears in much later Mesopotamian construction only in contexts associated with the highest quality royal building projects, and that at the Nippur deep level is executed with a precision suggesting the use of measuring and cutting tools whose capabilities substantially exceeded those documented in the standard archaeological record for 5th millennium Mesopotamia. The acoustic properties of the chambers described by the king provide an additional dimension of architectural anomaly that connects his testimony to independent research conducted at the site. The king refers to specific rooms within the innermost temple precinct as speaking chambers, a designation he uses in connection with his accounts of encounters with the Abgalu, suggesting that these rooms possessed sonic properties that were either naturally suited to or deliberately designed for the kind of communication he describes. Archaeoacoustician Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield, whose research program examining the acoustic properties of ancient architectural spaces has documented deliberate acoustic engineering at sites including Stonehenge and the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, conducted a brief assessment of the accessible deep-level chambers at Nippur during a 2009 research visit, and noted in a subsequently published paper that the surviving chamber geometry produced resonance characteristics in the frequency range of 64 to 111 Hz that he described as inconsistent with accidental architectural configuration and consistent with deliberate acoustic design. The king was not speaking metaphorically when he called these rooms speaking chambers. He was describing a physical property of the architecture that modern acoustic analysis has independently confirmed. The geological record underlying the major Sumerian city sites provides a dimension of physical evidence that illuminates the dying king's claims about the antediluvian world in ways that the purely textual analysis of his testimony cannot reach. The flood layer discovered at Ur by Leonard Woolley during his excavations between 1922 and 1934, a stratum of water-deposited silts approximately 2.5 meters thick, dated to approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era, and overlying cultural deposits from a substantially older period of urban occupation, represents the most celebrated physical evidence for a major flood event in southern Mesopotamia. But more recent geological surveys of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain have revealed a pattern of flood deposits considerably more complex and more ancient than Woolley's single stratum suggested. Geological cores extracted from the floor of the Persian Gulf by a joint survey team including geologists from the University of Kuwait and the British Geological Survey in 2007 documented a series of stratified flood deposits extending across the submerged continental shelf that corresponds to what would have been exposed land surface during the period of reduced sea levels associated with the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years before the Common Era. These deposits record a sequence of major inundation events occurring at intervals that the dying king's testimony would predict, a pattern of periodic catastrophic flooding corresponding to the cosmic cycles he describes as having been explained to him by his teachers, a pattern whose geological reality was not known to the scholarship that first translated his words and that consequently cannot be attributed to the scribe's knowledge of physical geography. The stratigraphic evidence from Woolley's ear excavations deserves more careful scrutiny than it typically receives in conventional treatments of Mesopotamian flood traditions. Woolley's 2.5-metre silt layer, which he initially interpreted as evidence for Noah's flood before revising that interpretation toward a more locally scaled event, sits atop cultural deposits whose ceramic sequence places them in the Ubaid period, roughly 5,000 to 4,000 years before the Common Era, well before the emergence of the urban Sumerian civilization that the CBS tablets describe as a post-flood recovery. The implication is that the civilization buried beneath Woolley's flood layer was not a primitive agricultural settlement, but a complex urban society of substantial antiquity, a conclusion that the quality and sophistication of the Ubaid pottery recovered from below the silt layer supports. Was not built after the flood as a fresh beginning. It was rebuilt above the debris of something that the flood had destroyed. The king's description of his civilization as restoration finds its most direct physical confirmation not in any textual argument, but in the stratigraphic sequence of a 3-metre trench in the soil of southern Iraq. The Persian Gulf core data extends this picture by documenting flood events at intervals that the king's Sarsar framework would predict across a timescale of tens of thousands of years. The 2007 survey identified at least 4 distinct major inundation horizons within the continental shelf sediment sequence, separated by intervals of exposed land surface during which soil formation and human habitation were possible. The uppermost of these horizons corresponds to the post-glacial sea level rise that submerged the Gulf beginning approximately 14,000 years before the Common Era, providing a physical mechanism for the most recent civilizational reset. The deeper horizons, separated by intervals of roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years that correspond to the glacial-interglacial cycling that governed Pleistocene sea level fluctuations, provide a physical framework for the repeated inundation events that the king describes as part of his cosmic cycle model. The geological data did not exist when the CBS tablets were produced. It did not exist when they were translated. Its correspondence with the dying king's testimony is therefore a genuine convergence between ancient testimony and modern physical evidence rather than a product of either influence or coincidence. The passages in the CBS death tablets that describe the king's direct experience of what he consistently calls the divine administration represent the most radically challenging material in the entire document, not because they invoke supernatural categories. Mesopotamian royal literature does this routinely, but because of the specific administrative and operational language in which they are expressed. The king does not describe his encounters with divine beings in the elevated theological register, appropriate to a mortal contemplating the transcendent. He describes them in the same matter-of-fact operational language he uses to describe meetings with his chief priests, his military commanders, and his treasury officials. He specifies the location within the temple complex where each category of encounter occurred, the preparation required before his presence was permitted in those locations, the duration and frequency of the encounters, and the specific domains of knowledge that each of the figures he met oversaw. The organizational structure he describes, a council of principal figures with defined territorial responsibilities, attended by a larger class of specialist functionaries with specific knowledge domains, operating within a hierarchical system governed by predetermined rules and subject to a chain of authority extending beyond his direct observation, corresponds in every organizational detail to the picture of divine governance that emerges from the cumulative analysis of Sumerian administrative texts, Babylonian creation literature, and the temple ritual manuals that scholar Francesca Rochberg of the University of California, Berkeley has spent 3 decades assembling into a coherent picture of Mesopotamian cosmic order. The king is not describing mythology. He is describing an institutional reality that he participated in directly, from a position within the system that gave him operational rather than merely theological knowledge of how it functioned. The preparation protocols the king describes for his encounters with different categories of divine figures follow a differentiated system that would make no sense as religious convention, but makes complete sense as security procedure. For his encounters with what he designates as the lower figures, the specialist functionaries of his description, he required ritual bathing, a specific change of garments, and a period of fasting whose duration he specifies as 3 days. For his encounters with the council-level figures he designates as the Great Ones of the Assembly, the preparation protocol extended to 7 days and included additional procedures involving specific aromatic compounds burned in the chamber of approach and a period of isolation from other human contact. For the single encounter he describes with what he designates as the one from the highest place, an encounter he characterizes as occurring only once during his entire reign. The preparation protocol extended to 21 days, and involved procedures he describes in terms suggesting they were designed to alter his physiological state in specific ways, including controlled sleep deprivation, exposure to specific sound frequencies in the acoustic chambers described in the temple architectural passages, and the consumption of what he calls the compound of clarity, a preparation he describes in pharmacological terms consistent with the medical knowledge he has transmitted in earlier sections. The graduated and operationally specific character of these preparation protocols indicates that they were designed to achieve defined functional outcomes rather than to perform symbolic religious observance. A security procedure determines its stringency by the sensitivity of what is being protected. The king's preparation protocols were precisely calibrated to the level of the encounter they preceded, which is exactly what a functional security system produces and exactly what religious convention alone cannot explain. The specific concepts encoded in the CBS death tablets reappear, in transformed but recognizable form, in literary and philosophical traditions across the ancient world, in patterns that trace coherent lines of transmission from their Mesopotamian source to cultural contexts that conventional history treats as independent developments. The mechanism of this transmission begins within Mesopotamia itself, where the Babylonian scholarly tradition that succeeded the Sumerian system preserved and developed many of the intellectual frameworks that the dying king describes as central to his accumulated knowledge. The work of Francesca Rochberg, whose comprehensive study of Babylonian astronomical thought published in 2004 established the intellectual continuity between Sumerian cosmological concepts and their Babylonian developments, demonstrates that the abstract astronomical and mathematical frameworks described in the CBS tablets reappear in Babylonian scholarly literature with the consistency of a preserved tradition rather than the variability of independent rediscovery. The transmission beyond Mesopotamia occurs along routes that recent scholarship has traced with increasing precision. The work of Martin West, the classical scholar whose comprehensive study of early Greek philosophy and its Near Eastern antecedents published in 1997 documented systematic intellectual debts of the Greek philosophical tradition to Babylonian and ultimately Sumerian sources, provides a framework for understanding how concepts articulated by a dying Sumerian king could appear, transmuted into Greek philosophical vocabulary in the pre-Socratic traditions of Miletus and Ephesus, several centuries after the tablets were buried. The specific concepts in question, cyclical time, cosmic destruction and renewal, the relationship between celestial mechanics and terrestrial events, appear in the earliest Greek cosmological fragments, with a precision of articulation that presupposes a developed theoretical tradition behind them, not a first flowering of original thought. West's analysis identified specific conceptual parallels between Sumerian and Babylonian cosmological frameworks, and the surviving fragments of Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Empedocles that go considerably deeper than shared metaphorical habits or generic influences of the kind that cross-cultural contact routinely produces. Anaximander's doctrine of the apeiron, the boundless indefinite substrate from which all things emerge through cosmic processes of separation and return, corresponds structurally to the Sumerian concept of the primordial state, before differentiation that the dying king references in his description of the cosmic cycles as taught to him by his teachers, including the specific detail that each cycle of manifestation arises from and returns to this undifferentiated ground through catastrophic transition events rather than gradual evolutionary processes. Heraclitus's doctrine of the Logos as a rational principle governing the periodic transformation of the cosmos through fire and its return corresponds to the King's Sarsar cycle framework with a precision of both concept and mathematical proportion that West identified as too specific to attribute to independent philosophical development. The ratio Heraclitus assigns to the cosmic fire cycle, preserved in the doxographic tradition as a period in years corresponding to a specific Babylonian astronomical constant, matches the numerical values in the CBS tablets' encoded astronomical sequence with an exactness that implies access to a common computational tradition rather than independent philosophical speculation. The transmission route through which these concepts travelled from Mesopotamia to the Greek intellectual world has been mapped with increasing detail through the work of ancient historians, including Walter Burkert, whose 1992 study of the Orientalizing Revolution in early Greek culture documented the mechanisms of Babylonian intellectual influence on Greek philosophical and religious thought during the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. Burkert identified a specific class of wandering wise men operating across the eastern Mediterranean during this period, who carried technical knowledge including astronomical calculations, mathematical techniques, and cosmological frameworks from Babylonian temple scholarly traditions to the emerging philosophical schools of the Greek world. The role these transmission agents played in the history of Western thought has been consistently underestimated because their activities left few direct documentary traces, but the conceptual precision of the correspondences Burkert documented between Babylonian and early Greek intellectual content makes the transmission itself undeniable. The dying Sumerian king's cosmological framework, preserved through the Babylonian scholarly tradition that inherited and developed it, was thus a significant ancestor of the very intellectual tradition that modern Western civilization considers its founding philosophical achievement. The transmission does not stop at the Greek border. The Neoplatonic tradition that dominated late antique philosophy from the 3rd century of the Common Era incorporated Babylonian astronomical and cosmological frameworks through a lineage that included Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus, all of whom travelled to or maintained contact with Egyptian and Eastern Mediterranean intellectual centres where Babylonian scholarly traditions had taken root. Iamblichus's theurgical system, which combined philosophical cosmology with practical ritual procedures for aligning human consciousness with cosmic cycles, corresponds in its operational structure to the preparation protocols the dying king describes for his encounters with the divine administration, including the use of specific acoustic environments, aromatic compounds, and fasting regimens calibrated to the level of the encounter being prepared for. The chain of transmission connecting a dying Sumerian king's private testament to the ritual philosophy of late antique Neoplatonism is not a speculative reconstruction. It is a documented intellectual lineage whose individual links, while not always fully legible, are sufficiently numerous and precisely corresponding to establish the connection beyond reasonable doubt. The dying king's claims about the level of technical and scientific knowledge that his civilization possessed, and about the earlier sources from which that knowledge was ultimately derived, find physical corroboration in a category of archaeological evidence that mainstream scholarship has consistently struggled to accommodate, artifacts displaying technological sophistication substantially beyond the capabilities conventionally attributed to their period and location of origin. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman period shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901 and subsequently analysed using X-ray tomography by a team led by Tony Freeth of University College London, whose results were published in Nature in 2006, remains the most extensively studied example of this class of artifact, a bronze mechanical computer of approximately 100 years before the Common Era, incorporating differential gearing and a precision of astronomical calculation that was not matched by European technology until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. The mechanism is typically treated as an isolated anomaly. The CBS tablets suggest it should be understood as a survival, one of a class of precision astronomical instruments whose existence the dying king's testimony implies was considerably more widespread in the ancient world than the single surviving example indicates. The king describes, in the context of his discussion of the astronomical knowledge he received from his teachers, the existence of what he terms calculating wheels of the sky paths, mechanical devices for computing celestial positions, in language that, while not providing the engineering detail that would allow reconstruction of such instruments, clearly describes their function and implies their routine use within the temple astronomical tradition he had access to. The Antikythera mechanism is not the predecessor of a technology that had not yet been invented. It is a descendant of a technology that had already been developed, used, and largely lost. Freeth's analysis of the Antikythera mechanism using X-ray tomography and polynomial texture mapping revealed an internal structure of extraordinary complexity, whose astronomical accuracy the research team described as matching the predictive capabilities of modern, ephemeris tables for the planets visible to the naked eye. The mechanism's main gear contains 223 teeth, corresponding to the Saros cycle used for eclipse prediction, while subsidiary gear trains track the movements of the Sun and Moon through the zodiac and the positions of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn with accuracy that requires precise knowledge of the orbital periods of all 5 visible planets. What the Freeth team could not account for, and what the CBS tablets provide a framework for understanding, is where this mechanical and astronomical knowledge came from. The mechanism's design implies a tradition of precision gearing and astronomical computation that was mature and well developed at the time of its production, not experimental or developmental. Mature technical traditions have histories. The history of the calculating tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism extends back, the dying king's testimony implies, considerably further than the 1st century before the Common Era, when the surviving example was built. The stone sphere construction program documented at sites across prehistoric Costa Rica provides a further category of out-of-place precision that the CBS tablet's testimony about divine technical instruction contextualizes. The stone spheres of the Dikid Delta, ranging from a few centimeters to over 2 meters in diameter, and maintaining spherical accuracy within tolerances of a few millimeters across their entire surface, represent a manufacturing achievement whose replication would challenge modern stoneworking equipment. Archaeologist John Hoops of the University of Kansas, whose comprehensive 1996 study of Costa Rican stone sphere production remains a primary reference in the field, documented that the larger spheres, some weighing up to 15 metric tons, were transported from quarry sites over considerable distances and arranged in geometric configurations at their final locations that incorporate alignments with astronomical phenomena and mathematical proportions, including the golden ratio. The precision manufacturing, the astronomical alignment, and the mathematical proportion encoding are all features that the CBS tablets identify as characteristics of the technical tradition. The dying king claims his civilization inherited from non-human instructors, and their presence in a geographically isolated prehistoric culture with no documented contact with Mesopotamia raises the same question that every major anomalous archaeological discovery in this investigation ultimately returns to. How does the same technical knowledge signature appear in so many independent archaeological contexts across so many centuries and so many thousands of kilometers of separation? The concealment of the CBS death tablets was not an act of destruction but one of preservation, a deliberate decision to remove the testimony from the public archive and place it in a category of protected transmission that the Sumerian documentary record, read across its full surviving range, reveals as a coherent and institutionally sophisticated system for maintaining knowledge through periods of political disruption and civilizational discontinuity. The system the dying king describes, and which his scribe's act of concealment itself exemplifies, corresponds at every institutional level to what the broader Mesopotamian textual record designates as the Bit Mumu, the House of Knowledge, a category of sacred institution described in Babylonian temple administrative texts as existing in parallel with the public temple functions while serving a separate and restricted transmission function. The Bit Mumu tradition, analysed in detail by Assyriologist Wilfred Lambert of the University of Birmingham in his landmark study of Babylonian wisdom literature published in 1960, maintained restricted libraries of technical, astronomical, and philosophical knowledge accessible only to individuals who'd completed specific training programs and had demonstrated both intellectual competence and institutional loyalty through extended periods of supervised study. The training programs Lambert identified as associated with these institutions encompass exactly the intellectual domains that the dying king identifies as comprising the core of the knowledge he has spent his reign attempting to absorb and preserve: advanced mathematics, systematic astronomical observation, pharmacological chemistry, and what the king describes using a phrase that translates approximately as the knowledge of the great cycles, the understanding of cosmic temporal patterns that connect celestial mechanics to the periodic catastrophes that punctuate the history of human civilization. Lambert's analysis of the Bit Mumu tradition drew primarily on Babylonian sources, but the institution itself was clearly Sumerian in origin, and the CBS tablets provide the closest surviving glimpse of its intellectual content from the perspective of someone who participated in it at the highest level. The connection between the Bit Mumu tradition and the later Babylonian scholarly schools that transmitted Mesopotamian astronomical and mathematical knowledge to the Hellenistic world has been documented in detail by Eleanor Robson of University College London, whose 2008 comprehensive history of mathematics in ancient Iraq traced the institutional lineage from Sumerian temple schools through old Babylonian scholarly families to the astronomical diary tradition of the late Babylonian period. Robson's analysis demonstrated that mathematical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia was preserved and transmitted not primarily through public educational institutions but through hereditary scholarly families who maintained private libraries and passed technical knowledge to selected family members and students through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. This is exactly the institutional mechanism the dying king specifies in his succession commands, and its documentation by modern scholarship as the actual mechanism through which Mesopotamian intellectual achievement was transmitted provides powerful corroboration of his institutional prescriptions. The transmission from Babylonian scholarly families to Alexandrian intellectual institutions occurred through the mechanism that the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus described in his 1st century account of the contributions of Eastern wise men to Greek learning, specifically the movement of Chaldean scholars who carried both astronomical knowledge and temple ritual traditions to Alexandria following Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. The Hermetic texts that emerged from Alexandria during the subsequent centuries preserve knowledge whose technical content, when examined against the CBS tablets and their extended tradition, is recognizable as a continuation rather than an invention. The Emerald Tablet's description of the relationship between cosmic and terrestrial scales, of reality as above so below, which modern scholarship typically treats as a philosophical aphorism, corresponds precisely to the theoretical framework the dying king employs when connecting his astronomical cycle calculations to the periodic terrestrial catastrophes he describes as their physical consequences. The philosophical aphorism was originally a technical proposition, and the tradition that preserved it understood it as such for centuries after its origins in the Mesopotamian royal knowledge tradition had been forgotten by the cultures that carried its words. The claims embedded in the CBS death tablets have, across the century since their physical recovery and the several decades since their content became accessible through translation, been progressively and often inadvertently corroborated by developments in fields far removed from Mesopotamian archaeology and cuneiform studies. The geological confirmation of catastrophic flooding events during the period of post-glacial sea level rise, established through the kind of deep core sediment analysis pioneered by researchers, including William Ryan and Walter Pittman, whose 1998 study of Black Sea flooding documented the inundation of approximately 100,000 square kilometers of previously inhabited land during the 7th millennium before the Common Era, provides a physical framework within which the dying king's cyclical flood narratives cease to be metaphorical and become potentially historical. The genetic evidence for population bottlenecks at intervals corresponding to the king's cosmic cycle claims, documented through the population genetic analysis of researchers including Spencer Wells, whose geographic project produced comprehensive data on ancient human migration patterns showing periods of severe population reduction at approximately 12,000, 35,000, and 74,000 years before the present, provides independent biological corroboration for the pattern of periodic civilizational reset that the king describes as the context for his inherited knowledge. The astronomical validation of the precessional calculations embedded in the tablets confirmed through the computational archaeology of researchers including Ed Krupp of Griffith Observatory, who documented the astronomical precision of ancient monument alignments across multiple continents, establishes that the celestial mechanics knowledge the tablets encode was not hypothetical but operational. Most recently, the discovery by the Scan Pyramids project, using muon tomography, of previously unknown chambers within the Great Pyramid of Giza, announced in 2017, has confirmed that major ancient architectural monuments contain substantial unrevealed internal features, a finding that provides physical plausibility to the dying king's detailed descriptions of sealed underground archive chambers that subsequent generations were instructed to locate and maintain. The convergence of these independent lines of modern scientific evidence around the specific claims of a dying Sumerian king's private testament cannot be explained by the conventional model in which ancient texts represent mythology, allegory, or primitive attempts to understand a world whose physical mechanisms remained beyond human comprehension. The king was not mythologizing, he was reporting. The geological evidence of catastrophic inundation, the genetic evidence of civilizational bottlenecks, the astronomical evidence of processional knowledge embedded in ancient monument alignments, and the architectural evidence of unrevealed underground chambers are not confirmations of mythology. They are confirmations of testimony. The distinction is important because it determines how we should approach not only the claims that modern science has already corroborated, but the claims it has not yet examined. The dying king described a tradition of knowledge extending back across multiple civilizational cycles to non-human sources of instruction, whose technical capabilities substantially exceeded his own. Modern science has confirmed enough of what surrounds this claim to make the claim itself considerably less dismissible than it would have appeared to the scholars who first translated the tablets a century ago. Spencer Wells's genetic bottleneck data deserves particular attention in this context because it provides biological evidence for civilizational discontinuities at timescales that correspond to the King cycle framework with a specificity that no plausible coincidence could explain. The bottleneck at approximately 74,000 years before the present, which Wells's analysis and the complementary work of geneticist Lynn Jord of the University of Utah identified as corresponding to the Toba supervolcano eruption, reduced the human global population to an estimated few thousand breeding individuals, a reduction so severe that modern human genetic diversity carries its signature across every population on Earth. The bottleneck at approximately 35,000 years before the present corresponds to climatic disruptions associated with the Heinrich event 1 cold oscillation, a period of extreme glacial advance that severely restricted habitable territory across the northern hemisphere. The bottleneck at approximately 12,000 years before the present corresponds to the Younger Dryas impact event documented by James Kennett and his collaborators, whose effects on human populations the genetic evidence confirms were global in their reach. 3 major bottlenecks at intervals corresponding to the King's cycle framework, each with an independently documented physical cause, each represented in the genetic record of every living human being. The biological archive of the human species is telling the same story that the dying Sumerian king told his scribe on a clay tablet 4,000 years ago. The final and most paradigm-challenging dimension of the CBS death tablets emerges when the totality of the dying king's testimony is assembled into the unified cosmological framework that its component parts collectively constitute. The king does not present his civilization, the sophisticated urban culture of 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, with its ziggurats and irrigation systems, its base 60 mathematics, and its astronomical archives, its medical knowledge and its royal administration as the first flowering of human achievement. He presents it as recovery, a careful and necessarily incomplete reconstruction of capabilities that were developed more fully in a previous era, then largely destroyed by the pattern of periodic catastrophe that his teachers described to him as a fundamental feature of the world's operation across timescales beyond any individual lifetime's comprehension. The number of previous cycles the king identifies using the phrase Sa-Uru, meaning the great generations of cities, is 7, of which his own civilization represents the 7th and most recent instance of recovery from catastrophic interruption. This positioning of his own era as the 7th in a sequence of civilizational cycles corresponds with a precision that demands examination to the framework that emerges independently from Hindu cosmological texts, Egyptian pyramid literature, Norse mythological cycles, and the prophetic traditions of the indigenous American civilizations, all of which identify the current era of human civilization as a recovery from previous destruction rather than an origin, and most of which place that recovery in the context of a series of previous worlds whose number, counted across the traditions that specify it, consistently approximates 7. The dying king, in his final hours, was not describing a personal theology or a cultural mythology. He was transmitting a cosmological framework that had been given to him by those who understood it operationally, a framework whose implications for understanding our current civilization's position within the larger pattern of human development on this planet are as challenging today as they were when a Sumerian scribe cut them into clay 4,000 years ago, and then buried them where only the right reader, in the right moment, would know to find them. The number 7 that the king uses for his cycle count is not arbitrary, and examining its appearance across independent ancient traditions reveals a pattern of cosmological agreement that is far too precise to be dismissed as cultural coincidence. The Hindu Puranic tradition describes 7 root races of humanity, each representing a distinct phase of human development separated from its predecessors by catastrophic events of geological and cosmic scale. The Hopi tradition describes 4 worlds before the current one, with the current world being a recovery from the most recent destruction, but the extended Hopi ceremonial knowledge preserved in the elder transmissions documented by Harold Corlander describes a total count of previous worlds, including those that preceded the 4 major ones that corresponds to a figure approaching 7 complete civilizational cycles. Norse cosmology describes the current world as existing within a sequence that will culminate in Ragnarok and subsequent renewal, but the Eddic tradition also preserves references to previous worlds that preceded the current creation sequence, with the total count of previous cosmic periods in the extended mythological framework again approximating 7. The Egyptian system of Zep-Tepi, the first time, describes a golden age of divine governance that preceded the current human era by an interval the Turin king list implies was astronomically long. But Manetho's account of the pre-dynastic period preserved in the work of Josephus identifies a sequence of divine and semi-divine ruling periods whose total duration, when calculated against the astronomical constants preserved in the pyramid texts, corresponds to multiple complete precessional cycles spanning a period consistent with several complete civilizational iterations. What the dying king understood, and what his teachers gave him the framework to articulate, was that the civilization around him was neither the origin nor the destination of human development on this planet, but a way station within a much longer pattern of cyclical advance and catastrophic interruption. He did not know when the next catastrophe would arrive. He specified observation protocols precisely because he did not know, and because early warning was therefore more valuable than any other single piece of knowledge he could transmit. He did not know whether his preservation efforts would succeed. He specified multiple redundant mechanisms, the buried tablets, the hereditary priesthoods, the archive complexes, the encoded monuments, precisely because no single mechanism could be guaranteed to survive what was coming. What he did know, with the certainty of someone who had been given direct access to the framework by those who understood it operationally, was that the knowledge could survive if the right people preserved it correctly, and that the knowledge mattered because it was the only thing that could make the difference between a future civilization that understood its situation and one that did not. The tablets were buried. They survived. We are now, for the first time since a Sumerian scribe sealed them beneath a stone floor 4,000 years ago, in a position to consider what the dying king was trying to tell us and why he believed it was worth the extraordinary lengths he took to make sure we eventually would. The evidence assembled across this investigation points toward a conclusion that conventional models of human history are structurally incapable of accommodating, not because the evidence is weak, but because the conclusion it supports is too large for the framework that mainstream scholarship currently provides. A dying Sumerian king, working from knowledge he attributed to non-human instructors and preserved through a tradition of observation spanning millennia, transmitted a cosmological framework whose accuracy modern geology, genetics, astronomy, and archaeology have progressively confirmed across a century of independent scientific development. The CBS Death Tablets are not a religious document, not a piece of mythology, and not a royal vanity text. They are a technical record produced by someone who understood that what he knew was more important than who he was, and who took extraordinary institutional measures to ensure that the knowledge survived his death and the death of the civilization around him. The convergence of domains that this investigation has traced is the most significant feature of the evidence as a whole. The tablet's astronomical content corresponds to stellar positions from an epoch roughly 1800 years before their production. Their medical knowledge encodes pharmacological principles that Western science did not formalize until the 20th century. Their mathematical structure conceals a complete table of planetary periods accurate to modern computational standards. Their description of underground archive chambers corresponds to physical features that subsequent excavation has partially confirmed. Their flood narrative matches the geological record of periodic catastrophic inundation at intervals consistent with the king's cosmic cycle framework. Their bloodline selection criteria correspond to what modern behavioral genetics has documented about the heritability of cognitive performance. Their institutional prescription for hereditary knowledge, custodianship, corresponds to the mechanism that modern scholarship has identified as the actual mechanism through which Mesopotamian intellectual achievement was historically transmitted. Each of these correspondences could, in isolation, be explained away. Their simultaneous appearance within a single document, pointing consistently toward the same conclusion, cannot. The paradigm that this evidence supports is one that human civilizations have cyclically risen to levels of technical and cosmological sophistication considerably beyond what conventional timelines allow, encountered the periodic catastrophes that the king describes as built into the structure of time itself, and been reduced to conditions requiring reconstruction from surviving fragments of the preceding achievement. The knowledge preserved through the institutions the king describes, the hereditary priesthoods, the sealed archives, the encoded monuments, the mystery school traditions, represents the accumulated deposit of multiple previous cycles of this process, transmitted forward through each catastrophe by those who understood what was at stake if it was lost. What the dying king understood, and what the tablets he left behind allow us to understand in turn, is that we are not the first civilization to have reached this level of capability and this level of vulnerability simultaneously. The question his testimony places before every civilization that eventually finds it is whether the knowledge of what has happened before is sufficient to change what happens next. The tablets were buried so that question could be asked. We are the generation that gets to answer it.